In this tutorial you will learn how to shade realistic looking crystals. We will first go through basic modeling preparations, then focus on creating realistic refractive materials, and finally set up translucency for interesting color variations. So we will work on this crystal here. We're gonna first learn how to set up some very basic modeling for this, but then more importantly talk about how to set up the shading for this, how we can add these kind of like trapped in air bubble effect, how we can set up interesting looking bump maps, and how we can do this kind of nice color transition from top to bottom. As usual, all the scene files are also available on my Patreon. You can support the channel through that if you want to. And now let's first start to check out how to set up some basic modeling for this here. So the modeling itself is very simple. As you can see, all I have is a bunch of simple primitive objects which are generated using, for example, cylinders, and then using some boxes to cut off using booleans, some pieces in order to get these kind of like diagonal faces in here. And I just generate a bunch of different sized ones and then just stack them together into this kind of nice looking assembly in here. So unfortunately we can't leave it like this because at the moment it is all individual pieces. And as soon as I start to add some refraction to my shader, it seems to kind of work to a certain extent. But if I show you the geometry that I cleaned up, and that would be this one, and if you focus on this part down here, you will see there's a lot more detail in here, and that is because this object here is one piece that I combined using pro booleans. I just added all of those pieces together. And by this way, if I show the wireframe, you can see there's no intersecting pieces here in the center of this object, but it's like one continuous volume, and that is very important for refractive objects in order to get the optimal result. Because in reality, all of this would grow naturally from crystals and they wouldn't be stuck into each other, of course. It would be like one volume. So that's why you need to prepare your geometry, especially if you work on refractive shaders where you're gonna see the inside of this object in here. So now the only thing I added was a very simple UV map that just goes from top to bottom, just a very simple planar UV map. And this I'm gonna use later on in order to have a color shift from top to bottom, and also as a mask to add different kind of bump details on different kind of heights here of our crystal. So now we can start with the shading, and as you can see, we already have a very simple shader here set up, just reflection and refraction at 100% for now. And now we're first gonna add a bit of detail here on our edges by just piping this here into a V-Ray bump material. And then in this V-Ray bump material, we can then just add a V-Ray edges texture. And then once I assign this material here to our selection, we can see with this edges texture, we can choose different kind of radiuses in here. And if I check my normal paths, you will see that now these normals, they get a bit more smooth. Let me just dial that back, for example, to 0.1. We can see we don't have this crazy sharp edges here anymore, as they would never appear in reality. So this is the original one, and with a 0.1 radius, we can like bevel these edges here a little bit, and that also just makes the overall result here a bit more smooth and a bit more realistic. So after we improve the edges of our crystal, let's also add some additional bump map in here. And for now, I like this upper part here. I think this should be smooth, like these kind of bigger crystals. But then this kind of like base here should be much more detailed. And at the moment, we see all of these kind of sharp edges, which come from this low poly geometry. So what I prepared is this very simple ramp in here. That's just a standard 3ds Max gradient. And I just add this here into this V-Ray light material so that we can just get a preview on how this ramp here is behaving on this object. Let me just assign this here to this object. And you can see it's just masking the whole thing from top to bottom. And then we have this kind of like smooth transition here towards the bottom. So we're gonna use this mask here in our bump map in order to add more bump in these kind of parts in here. So now let's start to work on our actual bump map, and let's just first increase the strength here to 100. Then we will add a V-Ray color to bump node in here. And then in this V-Ray color to bump, we will add a composite. And then in this composite, we'll start with one layer for now. And here we're just gonna put in a noise. And now we can see nothing because first we need to dial in some settings into this noise because at the moment this noise here is pretty big. So as soon as we go down with the size, we can see we have some noise going on. We can also go here for fractal and then also increase here the levels to 10. We can see we have now a lot of detail here everywhere on our crystal, but that's not really what we want. We only want to keep this detail in this lower part. So that's where our mask comes into play. So we will add an additional layer in here. Then we just add a V-Ray color map in here. And then this one will be the default gray value. That means there's no bump at all. So now we just need to mask this map here with our gradient that we added before. Once we do that, we will have no bump on those parts up here. And then we have a smooth transition with more bump towards the bottom here. Now let's just clean this up. We don't need this light material. Then we just put this mask down here. And then we will just dial back the intensity here of our bump map, for example, to something like 0.5 centimeters. And then here, this overall bump intensity will be less for this part here at the bottom. I think that looks a little bit more organic because we can still see the shapes here of these kind of crystals, but we have this just additional bump here on top. So now we're going to focus a bit on the upper parts, and at the moment they look quite simple, but in reality those parts always have some kind of imperfections or air bubbles or other kind of things inside, and that's what I try to simulate by just enabling this layer. You can see now there's all of these kind of details in those upper parts in here, and now I will show you how this is done, and that is actually super simple. So what we have here is a very simple plane. You can see it has 100 segments in length and width. Then I just added some small noise and then some additional noise on top to just get this random shape in here. So now let's put the reflection here to pure white and then also do the same for the refraction. Once we do that, we can see the result looks a bit weird, and that is because this one is a one-sided plane, and normally this one needs here a volume, but we can choose this thin-walled option, and then we have a much better result. And we have this kind of interesting looking shape. We can increase here our IOR to, for example, 2.5. And then we just have like this kind of half transparent reflective kind of surface in here. So now I just want to add an opacity map into here so that we just get a bit more detail and don't have this very obvious plane surface here. And once we do this, we just switch this one here to turbulence, choose a size of 1, and then, for example, also 10 levels. Now we just need to contrast this map a little bit in order to get some more obvious cutout parts. For example, high 0.7, low 0.2. Now we have like these kind of like tiny clouds in here. So now I just went ahead and I just took a bunch of those same planes here and I just scattered them in my scene, just rotated them randomly around so that we get this volume of different kind of planes in here. Now we can bring back our crystal and we can see that's not really the result we want because we have all of those parts here on the outside of the crystal, which we basically want to hide. So it's actually quite simple. We can just select all of our planes here and then we just go to the object properties and then we disable this visible to camera. And while we're at it, we also disable receive and cast shadows. And once we do this, we can see that now we have these kind of interesting shapes only appearing on the insides of our crystals in here. Now, if we want, we can also in the viewport just choose this option here to just only display them as a box so it's not so distractive. We can focus more on our crystal. Now we can just rotate all of those planes around and place these kind of like air bubbles exactly where we want to have them. In this instance here, I like the result how it's now, and now we can move on to the next part. So now we're back in the Slate Material Editor. Let's talk a bit about the different options that we have for our shader. So we have a fully refractive material for now with a little bit of bump, and we can choose different kind of IOR values, for example, 1.3. If we do this, we will see we have a drastically different result, and it is quite important that you just choose an IOR value that you think kind of works fine for you. For example, you can choose much higher IOR values for much more distortions inside here our volume. In my case, I will just leave it at 1.6, the default value. And I think I like this kind of result in here. And also one thing to note is that if you work on refractive material, it's always worth considering to enable this reflect on backside option, because that's how actual refractive materials work. In V-Ray by default, this is not enabled in order to save render time. If you enable this, you will see you will get a different result if you have refractive materials. And now it's also reflecting back on the inside. So if you focus on this part here, for example, you can see without it, it is just much darker. And with it, we have these additional reflections in here. Just take note that this kind of option adds a lot to render time. So you can always consider if the result is basically worth it or not. For my case, I will just leave it disabled now so that we can get a faster feedback time here in the viewport. Another additional option is this Eevee number option here. Once you enable this, the result will render much slower, but you will get these kind of interesting color shifts here in your material. And I think the result can look very nice in some cases. For these kind of crystal materials, it's maybe not really what we want, but I just want to show you how this parameter here works. So it's quite simple. The lower you go with this value, the more of these color shifts you will have, and the higher you go, the less you will have. So let's just choose, for example, here a value of 5. Then we will see we will get much more of these kind of color variations in here. The same way you can go to much higher values, and then we have very subtle this kind of effect in here. And like this, you can basically fine-tune the effect to whatever you want. Just be aware, adding this kind of option takes a lot of render time because the refractions will become much more complicated to calculate. In this instance here, I will also leave it disabled so that we can get faster feedback time. So now let's work on the glossiness of the refraction and reflection of our material. And we can see that we have this super perfect straight lines in here. That's because the refraction and reflection is not broken up at all. And that's kind of unnatural. In reality, all of those materials, they would always have a different kind of degree in glossiness. And for this, we have this kind of V-Ray bitmap here, which are gonna map into the glossiness of our shader. Now we're just gonna pipe this bitmap here through color correction so that we just can define the glossiness amount later on. Let's just switch this here to advanced. And then we're also gonna map this, of course, into our reflection and then into our refraction glossiness. So now you can see the result here. This looks, of course, way too blurry. We're gonna deal with this in a second, but you can see this kind of interesting horizontal lines that are appearing here. And that's a side effect from this planar UV that we used before. So our textures are stretching here on one side, but in reality, you also see this kind of result here quite often, or this kind of effect. That's why I'm gonna leave it in here. And now I'm just gonna up the gamma in order to just have less contrast in our map and make it brighter. And then this way, our material will also appear much less blurry. So I think like this result looks pretty good. We have like these kind of highlights here broken up. You can see they are not exactly like a perfect line in here. We have these kind of like interesting breakups in here. And we also have these kind of horizontal lines. I think this all looks quite good. And now the only thing to do is to take care of the color here of our crystal. To define the color of our crystal, we need to check out this tab right here. There's different kind of modes. At the moment, we will focus on this translucency none mode. And then later we're gonna switch to this volumetric mode in here. So here we can choose different kind of colors. For example, I can choose like this reddish color in here. And then with this depth value, I can define how strong the color becomes. So if I make a higher value, then that means the color will become less strong. The material would need to be much thicker in order to pick up this color. And if I go to much smaller values, then you can see our whole crystal is instantly completely red. So we're not going to use this value in here. What we're going to use will be this translucency mode set to volumetric. And then here you can see if I go with lower values in here, then we will have like a translucency effect going on. That means we can't really look completely through our object. Only those thinner parts, as you can see here, become a bit more refractive. The whole thing we can also define here with this depth value. So if I choose depth value very high, then you will see it almost becomes a solid. And if I go to much higher values, then we will have just a little bit feeling of this kind of translucency here. Let's choose, for example, first a value of 1. Then we have this kind of half solid object in here. And now what we can do is to add this kind of scatter color. So if we add, for example, this reddish scatter color, then we will also tint here our crystal. So instead of using these two values, I prepared two different gradients ramps. And those we're going to use for our fog color and our scatter. So this gradient here, we're going to map into the fog color. As you can see, I just keep this lower part here completely white, then just slowly fade it off towards the top. And then we just map this into the fog color. And then you can see we will have this kind of effect that we have like here a very translucent part of our object, and then here a part where we can clearly see through. So now we just need to define the depth, and for this, for example, if we go with higher values, then this kind of contrast is not so strong anymore. So the upper part also becomes more transparent, and we're able to see through a little bit. And now instead of using this scatter color, I also have a gradient in here where I just have this kind of bluish shift to reddish to a little bit white here. And then I just map this into the scatter color. And now we can see we have this kind of effect where we have a little bit of more bluish color down here. And then we have like this smooth transition towards the top. Now we just need to find the correct depth value. Let's choose here a value of 25, for example. And like this way, the effect is not so strong anymore, but we still can clearly see this nice gradient from here to here, where these parts here are a little bit bluish, and then up here, those parts become a little bit purple. So with this, we basically finished here our crystal. If there's something unclear, let me know in the comments. I normally tend to answer all of my comments. Other than that, if you want, as said, you can download this whole scene file on my Patreon together with all of my other scene files. So check out this if that's useful for you and if you want to support this channel. Other than that, see you in the next tutorial. Take care and see you soon.